Here we have another life-size piece, very much in a classical vogue, but more after the realistic delineation of an 18th century gentleman. This is actually of the Gothic writer William Beckford, who wrote Vathek, which is an extreme horror story in sort of high art terms of its period. Quite militant, atheistic, sort of amoral, and he was a bit of a sort of a so-and-so, and he's captured here as he would like to have been seen by both himself and doubtless his favourable contemporaries. This is from Ironmonger's Hall, and it's by Moore. And again, the importance of these pieces is their monumentality. This is life-size, in stone. I have another classical piece from St Paul's, very sort of neoclassical in feel, idealised. A strong element of narratives creeping into this type of sculpture at this time. This is from 1808, right at the beginning of the 19th century. It celebrates probably the death of a man in combat, maybe in the Napoleonic and French Revolutionary Wars of the period. An angel has come down and weeps upon his tomb. A shroud has sort of been put on one side. The man, or the sort of transubstantiation of his corpse, reanimated in accordance with the Christian doctrine of second birth, looks out into the distance. You see strongly elitist, hierarchical and storytelling concerns, three-dimensionally, in stone, in one of our major cathedrals. Here we have another piece which is almost a lying in state, really, but it's of another aristocratic female lying side on, probably in a priory or vicarage in Kent. It's again this desire to depict people in death in terms of classical and Christian relief. There's a certain heaviness to the piece. It's very English, very stolid. There's always been the view, particularly on the continent and by certain art critics, that English classicism doesn't work too well because their comparison is always the Southern European tradition, where in actual fact it's the same type of art, but it is a different version of it. It's one in which some of the foursquare and stolid values of English self-determination and three-dimensionality come through. From the very beginning of the sculpture that we've looked at in this short film, we can see certain abiding characteristics that pre-exist everything, irrespective of style, time and place. Here's the Duke of Queensberry, from earlier in the period that we're looking at in terms of this particular type of classical sculpture, sort of restoration, 1660 through to the middle and latter stages of the 19th century, when the style doesn't change too much and is very much of a piece. This is by John van Noost. It's in Scotland. It's very ornate and is quite baroque in spirit. He lies in death upon a bed or divan, sort of swooning and thinking great thoughts, with several cherubs above him. And there's a plaque that doubtlessly lists his honorific titles and so on. And there's a sort of Doric column next to him, and on the other side, and an arch over. Don't forget, this is life-size, extremely heavy, and the point is to indicate breeding, monumentalism, importance, and a link to the ancient world. Here we have another classicizing piece, life-size, from about 1685, so quite a way back, but the style, you'll notice, from the Restoration in 1660 through to possibly the Great Reform Act in 1867, is very much of a piece. You could almost argue it could have been done, this particular relief, I think of somebody called Sir John Cutler, at any time during that period. This is a very large and ornate piece by Nicholas Reed in Westminster Abbey, 1766. Again in the style that we become conversant with during this phase of the film and this historical period with which it deals. It's a monument to Admiral Tyrrell. Behind him, in relief, you can see his ship, you can see battle scenes, you can see a sort of angel, or his guardian angel, or the spirit of victory, or his soul leaving his body in accordance with the doctrine of transubstantiation. You can see billowing sails overmastering the top of this angelic image, and so on. It's a very big relief with three-dimensional elements. Probably would have taken several years to actually carve and produce. A piece from the early part of the 19th century, 1825. The bowler, cricketing bowler from Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire by Henry Rossi. It's slightly more populist work, this one, dealing with sport. The bowler is of course anonymous. It's classical in its deportment and delineation, but of course he's clothed. And you see an encroachment of popular sensibility here, as well as a narrative element. It relates, of course, much more to the period in which it was produced than to notions about the ancient world. So you're beginning to see a sort of realism in certain elements, even of classical sculpture. Yes, here we see another large mausoleum. It's by Joseph Rose the Elder. It again would commemorate an aristocratic or very upper class family. It's in Reigate in Surrey, dates from the early part of the 18th century. The figures are relatively small, or maybe the photograph is from a distance. They might be life-size, but an enormous and monumental edifice here. It's virtually like a sort of a rock wall in neoclassical and heightened vogue, dedicated to the power and sort of magnificence of this provincial family. And it shows you the desire these people had to immortalise themselves as sort of provincial imperial figures in their area, to be watched by their own community as they perceived it forever and ever. Here's another of these increasingly Rococo pieces that we've been looking at, this sort of heightened Baroque classicism of an aristocratic couple gazing in an adoring way at each other, the female lying beneath the male. This is from Suffolk. The sculptor is Abraham Story. Again, we're looking at the early part of this period, the Restoration, through to the middle of the 19th century. This piece dates from 1678. And it shows, yet again, the ideals about themselves that the provincial English and British aristocracy had. A monumentalism, a heightened Baroque sensibility, a classicism, and a desire to glorify in family, nationality and self.